In this lesson, we're going to finish refactoring this lesson endpoint to fetch the correct lesson from our database. So we've mostly got what we need here for this endpoint, but we don't want to find the first one. We don't want to only look at the chapter slug, and we do not need to include this whole chapter in here. So we're going to get rid of that part. And we're actually going to introduce another field here in the where clause, and that's going to be the slug. So now what this method is doing is finding the first that matches these two parameters. The slug of the lesson must match lesson slug, and the slug of the chapter must match chapter slug. If we come over to Hopscotch and run this again, we can see that, in fact, we do get the correct lesson here. But before we had error handling in this endpoint, and so we want to add that back in to this endpoint now. So we'll add an await here. We'll put in an error handling block here to check if we've actually returned the correct lesson or a lesson at all. And then we'll finally return the lesson at the end of the method. So we'll double check that this endpoint is still working correctly. And then we'll go to our chapter not found, where we query for a chapter slug and lesson slug that do not exist. And we return a status code of 404. So that's perfect. But now that we've updated this endpoint, we also need to update the useLesson composable that fetches from this endpoint. We need to update it because this type here is no longer correct. We're getting this lesson back, but it's no longer the same lesson type. Instead, we need to import the lesson type from Prisma. But one thing that we are missing now is that this endpoint does not return the path that this lesson has. So before we were adding the path on, because we're not saving it in the database, and it is missing from this object. So we need to go and add that on right now. So we'll come back to this lesson slug here, and at the end, we'll add this in. We'll copy over this path, which is not quite the same, but almost the same. And now we're returning the lesson with the path. But this presents an issue to us because this lesson type here that we get back from Prisma does not have a path on it. So we're going to go back into our course types file here where we've defined all of these different types. And we're going to redefine what this lesson with path type is. And to redefine it, we're simply going to import the lesson from Prisma and use that as the base instead. Now, if we go back to our useLesson composable, then we'll actually change it back to what we had before. So we've gone a little bit in a roundabout way here, but we now have the correct types because this lesson with path has the correct lesson type from Prisma, which will stay in sync with our Prisma schema and our database schema. And then we add that additional path field on top of it. So if we come back to our app, we'll give it a refresh to make sure that we're using the latest code. And sure enough, everything works as it should. So in this lesson, we finished refactoring our use lesson endpoint to get data from Supabase through the Prisma client. And in the next lesson, we'll do the same for the course meta endpoint.